There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary. They wear the camouflage of a Tuesday afternoon or a shared cup of coffee, or, in our case, the oppressive, humming silence of a cheap motel room somewhere in the vast, empty heart of Nebraska. The moment itself felt deceptively simple. Two friends on a road trip, sharing a room to save a few dollars. But the space between the two double beds had become a canyon of unspoken things, and the air was thick with the weight of 100 nights just like this one, and 100 nights that were nothing like it at all. Julian was asleep, or pretending to be, in the bed closest to the window. I was in mine, staring at the textured ceiling, trying to map the constellations in the water stains. For 3 nights, this had been our pattern. We'd talk until late, the conversation spiraling into the familiar, comfortable grooves our friendship had worn over the years, and then we'd retreat to our separate islands of mattress and cheap polyester comforter. But tonight, the silence wasn't comfortable. It was charged, electric. It felt like the air before a storm, when the sky turns a strange, bruised purple and the world holds its breath. I had been cataloging the sounds of the night. The distant groan of a truck shifting gears on the interstate, the shuddering gasp of the ice machine down the hall, the almost imperceptible hum of the mini-fridge in the corner. Beneath it all, there was the sound of Julian's breathing. It was the only sound that mattered. For months, it had been the rhythm section of my life, a steady beat I had learned to sleep to wake to exist alongside. But tonight, the rhythm was off. It was shallower, quicker. It was the breathing of someone who was not at peace. I turned my head on the flat, starchy pillow, my gaze falling on him. The thin curtains did little to block the jaundiced glow of the motel parking lot lights, and it cast his sleeping form in a strange chiaroscuro. One arm was flung over his head, his dark hair a messy sprawl against the white pillowcase. His face, usually so animated and open, was slack with something that looked like exhaustion, but it was a deeper exhaustion than just the miles we'd driven. It was a weariness of the soul. I knew this weariness. I had been watching it consume him for the better part of a year, had been the silent witness to its slow, corrosive progress, and I had, in my own quiet way, tried to be a bulwark against it. Then he moved. It was a small shift, a restless twitch at first, the kind of movement one makes in a dream. He mumbled something incoherent, a single slurred syllable that was swallowed by the hum of the air conditioner. He rolled onto his side, facing me. My own breath hitched in my chest. Even with the 6 feet of worn carpet between us, it felt like a closing of a circuit. His eyes remained closed, but the stillness was gone. Another slow, deliberate roll, and his feet touched the floor. My heart began a frantic, panic drumming against my ribs. What was he doing? Was he having a nightmare? Was he sleepwalking? My mind raced through a dozen rational explanations, each one more flimsy than the last. He stood there for a moment, a silhouette against the sickly yellow light, and then he took a step, and another. He crossed the small expanse of no man's land between our beds, his movements slow and dreamlike, but unerringly precise. He wasn't sleepwalking. This was something else. This was a pilgrimage. He stopped at the edge of my bed, looking down at me. I held perfectly still, feigning sleep, my eyes squeezed shut so tightly I could see bursts of light behind my eyelids. I felt like a wild animal trying to blend into the scenery, convinced that if I didn't move, the predator would pass me by. But I wasn't the prey. I was the destination. The mattress dipped beside me. The shift in weight was monumental, a tectonic event that sent a tremor through my entire body. I could feel the heat radiating from him, could smell the faint, familiar scent of his soap and the day's travel on his skin. He lay down on top of the comforter, on his side, his body a rigid line just inches from mine. We lay there like two effigies on a tomb, parallel and silent. Seconds stretched into minutes. The silence in the room was no longer just an absence of noise. It had become a physical presence, a heavy blanket smothering us both. I could feel the question in his stillness, the desperate, unspoken thing he had carried across the room. He was waiting. He had made his move, a terrifying, vulnerable advance into my territory, and now it was my turn. The air was vibrating with the sheer force of everything we had never said. And in that humming, charged silence, I understood that this ordinary Tuesday in a Nebraska motel was the end of one life and the beginning of another. All I had to do was decide which one I wanted to live. To understand the weight of that moment, the sheer, terrifying gravity of Julian lying stiffly on my motel bed, you have to understand the architecture of our friendship. We built it 9 years ago, during my sophomore year of college. It was a structure I had come to inhabit so completely that I could no longer imagine my life outside of its walls. I was a photography student, most comfortable when there was a lens between me and the world. My natural state was one of quiet observation, lingering at the edges of things, documenting moments rather than participating in them. I saw the world in frames, in compositions of light and shadow, and people were often just elements within that frame, their emotional lives a story I could guess at but never truly touch. My own room was a darkroom, a literal and metaphorical space where I could take the chaotic light of the outside world and develop it into something quiet, stable, and understandable. Julian was the opposite of all that. He was a supernova in the muted galaxy of our university campus. A software engineering major, sure, but his real talent was people. He moved through crowds with an effortless grace, collecting friends like he was gathering wildflowers. He was loud and bright, and irrepressibly alive. His laughter wasn't just a sound. It was an event that could change the energy of an entire room. He was captain of the club rugby team, a consultant for some student-led tech initiative, the guy who knew the best place for late-night food and was on a first-name basis with the owner. He was, in every conceivable way, out of my league. Not romantically, I told myself, but socially, energetically, cosmically. We moved in different orbits, at different speeds. A collision seemed impossible. And then it happened. We were assigned as partners for a mandatory interdisciplinary project, a nightmare of a course called Innovation and Society. We were meant to design a theoretical app that solved a social problem. It was the kind of academic busywork I despised, and he excelled at. Our first meeting was a study in contrasts. I showed up at the library with a sketchbook full of moody, abstract concepts about connection and isolation. He arrived 10 minutes late, smelling faintly of grass and sweat from rugby practice, with a half-eaten burrito and a laptop covered in stickers. He took one look at my charcoal sketches of lonely figures connected by fragile lines and gave me a blindingly brilliant smile. "All right, artsy," he'd said, his voice a warm baritone that seemed to vibrate in my chest. "I'm Julian. I do the code. You do you do that." He gestured vaguely at my sketchbook. I felt my face flush, a hot wave of embarrassment, and something else, something I couldn't name. I expected him to be dismissive, to take over the project with his easy confidence and relegate me to designing a logo at the last minute. It was a dynamic I was used to. But he didn't. He leaned in, his chin propped on his hand, and he actually looked at my drawings. He asked questions. He didn't just see abstract shapes. He saw the ideas behind them. He listened. It was, at the time, a revelatory experience. No one had ever looked at my work with such genuine, unpretentious curiosity. Over the next few weeks, the project became our world. We spent hours huddled in a corner of the library, then in my small, cluttered studio apartment because the library closed too early. He would pace around my living room, brainstorming features and user flows, while I sketched out interfaces on a massive roll of paper taped to the floor. He filled my quiet space with his energy, but it wasn't an invasion. It was an infusion. He'd bring takeout, make terrible jokes, and describe the intricate logic of his code with the same passion I reserved for the chemical processes of film development. I found myself talking more than I usually did, explaining the principles of visual hierarchy and emotional design. He didn't just listen, he understood. He saw the structure and the system in my art, and I saw the creativity and the elegance in his logic. We found a shared language in the space between our two worlds. The friendship, the real one, was solidified the night before the project was due. We were in my apartment, running on fumes and caffeine. The app was done, the presentation was polished, but we just kept talking. He told me about the pressure he felt from his family, a long line of engineers and doctors who saw his social butterfly nature as a charming but ultimately frivolous distraction. He talked about feeling like he was always performing, always having to be the on guy, and how exhausting it was. In the quiet of my apartment, surrounded by my half-finished projects and the smell of fixer, he let the mask slip. He was still bright, but it was a softer light, like a star seen from a great distance. And I, in turn, told him things I had never articulated to anyone. I told him about my camera, how it was both a shield and a bridge, how it allowed me to be close to the world without the terrifying risk of being seen, how I felt more myself in the silent, solitary red glow of the darkroom than I did anywhere else. He didn't call me shy or weird. He just nodded, his expression thoughtful. "So you're like a translator," he said finally. "You take all this noise," he waved a hand at the window, "and you translate it into something people can actually understand. Something beautiful. No one had ever described what I did that way." He saw it not as a retreat, but as a craft. He saw me. That was the beginning. My feelings for him began to bloom in the darkroom of my heart, an image slowly developing in a chemical bath I couldn't control. It was a quiet, hopeless kind of love. I knew who he was, knew the string of charming, smart, beautiful girlfriends who would become a feature of his life. I saw the way he was with them, attentive, affectionate, a textbook great boyfriend. And I accepted my role. I was his best friend. I was the constant, the fixed point in his chaotic orbit. I was the one he came to when he fought with a girlfriend, or when he got a job offer he wasn't sure about, or when he just needed a quiet place to crash. My apartment became his sanctuary, and I became his confessor. It was a painful role, listening to him talk about loving someone else, but the pain was a small price to pay for his presence in my life. I built sturdy walls around that secret affection, reinforcing them with every platonic hug, every shared pizza, every "I love you" man tossed casually over his shoulder as he left. The friendship was the most important structure I had ever built. I would have done anything to protect it. I would not be the one to test its foundations. I would not be the one to light the match. For years, the architecture of our friendship held firm. The boundaries were clear, the roles defined. He was the planet, and I was the moon, held in his orbit, reflecting his light. My own tidal emotions kept secret and unseen on the dark side. The shift, when it came, was not a sudden earthquake, but a slow, geological process. A continental drift I only recognized in retrospect. The catalyst was Amanda. She was not just another girlfriend. She was the one. The one he brought home for Christmas. The one whose toothbrush had a permanent place in his bathroom. The one he talked about in terms of we and our. They were together for 3 years, a lifetime in our mid-20s. I watched their relationship with a familiar, muted ache. I liked Amanda, genuinely. She was kind and funny, and she understood Julian's need for both a party and a quiet night in. She understood that my friendship with him was a strange, unshakable pillar in his life, and she never seemed threatened by it. For that, I was grateful. When he was with her, he seemed complete, his restless energy finding its home. And then, it was over. The breakup was brutal and swift, a clean break that left a jagged wound. It wasn't about infidelity or a single, dramatic fight. It was worse. It was the slow, dawning realization that they wanted different futures. She had a job offer in London. He was tied to his consulting work here. Neither was willing to compromise on the life they had envisioned for themselves, and they were smart enough to see that resentment would eventually poison everything they had. So they made the sensible, adult decision to end it. It was a logical choice that felt, to Julian, like a catastrophic failure. The future he had been building for 3 years had been condemned and demolished overnight. He called me the night it happened. His voice was hollow, stripped of all its usual warmth and vibrancy. He didn't cry. It was scarier than that. He just sounded empty. "It's over," he said, and the 2 words hung in the air between our phones like a death sentence. I didn't offer platitudes or advice. I just said, "Where are you?" He was at his apartment, the one he had shared with her, now a museum of their shared life. Every object, every piece of furniture, was an artifact of a happiness that no longer existed. "I'm coming," I said, and hung up. When I let myself in with the spare key he'd given me years ago, the silence was the first thing that hit me. Julian's apartment was never silent. There was always music, or a game on the television, or the sound of him on the phone. Now it was a vacuum. He was sitting on the couch, staring at the blank television screen, a half-empty bottle of whiskey on the coffee table beside him. He looked smaller, diminished, as if the force of the breakup had physically compressed him. I didn't say anything. I just sat down on the other end of the couch, leaving a careful, respectful distance between us. We sat like that for an hour, maybe more, in a silence that was more profound than any conversation. That night was the beginning of the change. He wasn't looking for a shoulder to cry on, not in the traditional sense. He was looking for an anchor. He started showing up at my apartment, often late at night, with the flimsy excuse of being in the neighborhood. He would bring no food, no movie, no agenda. He would just arrive. He'd sink into my old, worn armchair, the one that had molded itself to the shape of his body over the years, and he would just sit there. Sometimes he'd talk, rehashing the details of the breakup, trying to pinpoint the exact moment it had all gone wrong. But more often than not, he would be silent. He was there for the presence. My quiet, undemanding presence. My apartment, which had always been his sanctuary from the noise of the world, now became his refuge from the noise in his own head. The first time he fell asleep on my couch, it felt significant. He'd been talking, his voice growing slower and softer, until it just trailed off. I looked over and his head had tipped back against the cushions, his mouth slightly open, his face finally peaceful in sleep. I felt a powerful, protective urge wash over me. I got up quietly, retrieved the old Afghan from the back of my closet, and draped it over him. I stood there for a long moment, watching the steady rise and fall of his chest. It felt like a sacred duty to stand guard over his sleep. The lines were starting to blur. I was no longer just the friend. I was becoming the caretaker, the harbor master, the keeper of his peace. He was drifting, unmoored, and he had instinctively navigated his way to my shore. And I, fool that I was terrified and thrilled to let him dock. The foundation of our friendship was beginning to feel the strain, the solid ground shifting into something more like water, and I didn't know if we were learning to swim or if we were both just beginning to drown. The couch became a permanent fixture in the landscape of his grief, and by extension, in the geography of my apartment. What began as an occasional, accidental sleepover soon morphed into a ritual. 3 or 4 nights a week, I would find myself working late in my studio, the soft sounds of Julian's slumber providing a strange, comforting soundtrack from the other room. It was an arrangement suspended in a delicate state of plausible deniability. He was there because his own apartment felt like a ghost ship. I was letting him stay because I was a good friend. Any other interpretation was a dangerous fantasy, a projection of my own deeply buried hopes. I told myself this every night as I draped the Afghan over his sleeping form. I was just being a friend, but my heart knew I was lying. The ritual began to evolve, its mutation small and almost imperceptible at first. It started with movie nights. He'd suggest we watch something, a mindless action movie or a comedy, something to fill the silence. We'd sit on the couch, and as the evening wore on and exhaustion set in, the space between us would shrink. It would start with his foot brushing against mine. Then, he would shift, his leg pressing against my thigh. Finally, inevitably, his head would find its way to my shoulder. The first time it happened, I froze. My entire body went rigid, every muscle screaming. It felt like a brand, a claim. His hair was soft against my neck, and I could feel the warmth of his breath on my skin. "Sorry," he mumbled, his voice thick with sleep. "Just so tired." The excuse was the key. It was the password that allowed us to cross this new boundary without acknowledging it. I forced myself to relax, to let my own head rest against his. "It's okay," I whispered to the dark room. And it was more than okay. It was a terrifying, exquisite agony. From there, the escalation continued. The couch was no longer enough. One night, after a particularly bad week at work had left him frayed and hollow-eyed, He appeared at my door later than usual. He looked wrecked. "Hey," he said, his voice raspy. "Sorry to just show up. I can't be there tonight." The silence is too loud. I stepped aside and let him in. He walked past me and straight to the spare room, a small, cell-like space I mostly used for storage. "Do you mind?" he asked, gesturing to the single bed. "The couch is killing my back." Again, the excuse. The plausible reason. "Of course not," I said, my voice sounding unnaturally high. "Make yourself at home." That night, I lay in my own bed, a wall and 20 feet of hallway separating us, and felt his presence more acutely than when he was on the couch. He was in my home, not as a guest in the living room, but as an occupant. He was behind a closed door, in a bed. The domesticity of it was a punch to the gut. This was what it would be like, I thought, and the thought was so painful and so beautiful that I had to physically press a hand to my chest. The next morning, he emerged looking more rested than I had seen him in months. "Slept like a rock," he announced, giving me a grateful smile that made my knees feel weak. "Your spare room is magic." The spare room became the new couch. But the barrier of the wall remained. Until the night of the thunderstorm. A massive, violent storm rolled in late one evening, shaking the old building to its foundations. The power flickered and died, plunging us into a sudden, deep darkness. We were sitting in the living room, lit only by the intermittent, strobing flashes of lightning. Julian had always been unnerved by storms, a childish fear he'd never quite shaken. With every clap of thunder, I saw him flinch, his body tensing. Around midnight, I was getting ready for bed when a particularly loud crack of thunder rattled the windows in their frames. A moment later, my bedroom door creaked open. He stood in the doorway, a pale ghost in the gloom. "Leo," he whispered. My heart stopped. "Yeah," I said, sitting up. "Couldn't sleep," he said, his voice small. "Bad dream," another excuse, delivered into the storm-tossed darkness. He didn't move from the doorway. He was waiting for an invitation. This was a new threshold, a far more significant one than the living room or the spare room. This was my room, my space. The door he was standing in was not just the entrance to my bedroom. It was the final barrier protecting the fragile secret of my heart. To invite him in was to risk everything. To turn him away was unthinkable. You can stay in here if you want," I heard myself say. The words felt like they were pulled from me. "The storm's pretty bad," he nodded, a barely perceptible motion in the dark. He came in and didn't get into the bed. Instead, he grabbed the spare pillows and a blanket and made a sort of nest for himself on the floor at the foot of my bed. It was a compromise, a negotiation of boundaries that we were both too terrified to articulate. He was in the room, but he was on the floor. Close, but separate. It was enough. And it was too much. I lay awake for hours, listening to the sound of the rain and the sound of his breathing, this time from only a few feet away. I was acutely aware of him, of his warmth and his scent filling my room. It felt like my own personal fortress had been gently, irrevocably breached. The floor did not last long. A few nights later, another bad dream, this time, when he appeared in the doorway, he looked even more lost. I didn't even wait for him to speak. I just shifted over to one side of my queen-sized bed and lifted the edge of the comforter. It was an invitation, clear and unambiguous. He hesitated for only a second before crossing the room and sliding into the bed beside me. The space he left between us was a taut, charged wire. We lay on our backs, staring at the ceiling, not touching. But I could feel him. I could feel the heat of his body, the slight weight of his presence on the mattress. Every tiny shift he made, every breath he took, was a seismic event. This became the new ritual, the final stage in our slow, terrifying waltz of intimacy. He would start in the spare room, and sometime in the deep, quiet hours of the night, he would slip into mine. We never spoke of it in the morning. We would wake up, carefully untangle ourselves if sleep had brought us closer together, and he would thank me for letting him crash. The pretense was absurd, a thin piece of paper we were holding up to shield us from the blazing sun of the truth. But we clung to it, because the alternative was to admit that this was no longer friendship, and neither of us was brave enough to say what it was instead. The door to my bedroom was now permanently left ajar, an open question hanging in the silent air of my apartment. The road trip was Julian's idea. He presented it as a prescription, a cure for the malaise that had settled deep into his bones. "I need to see something big," he'd said one evening, pacing my living room with a restless energy that had become his new normal. "Something that isn't these same four walls. I need a horizon." He wanted to drive west, all the way to the Pacific, with no real plan or schedule. Just drive. And he wanted me to come with him. For him, it was an escape. For me, he framed it as an opportunity. "Think of the pictures, Leo," he'd urged, his eyes alight with a spark I hadn't seen in months. "The desert, the mountains, the coast. It's the project of a lifetime." He was right, of course. It was a photographer's dream. But I knew, and I think he knew, that the photos were just an excuse, another layer of plausible deniability. The real purpose of the trip was to put the two of us in a sealed container, a four-door sedan hurtling through space, and see what happened. It was an act of profound recklessness or profound faith. I couldn't tell which. So I said yes. We packed the car with my camera gear, 2 duffel bags of clothes, and a cooler full of snacks. The first few days were a blur of highways and diners, of podcasts and shared playlists. The vast, open spaces of the country seemed to have a positive effect on Julian. The further we got from the geography of his old life, the more the tension seemed to bleed out of him. The easygoing, charismatic Julian I had first met began to reappear in flashes, in his laughter at a bad joke, in the way he'd sing along, off-key, to the radio. And with every mile we drove, the careful boundaries we had constructed in my apartment began to erode under the pressure of constant, unavoidable proximity. The motel rooms were the crucibles where this erosion was most apparent. The first night, we got a room with 2 beds. It felt like a regression, a return to a formality that no longer fit. We lay in our separate beds, the silence between us feeling stilted and artificial. The second night, Julian stood at the registration desk of a dusty roadside motel and, without even looking at me, said to the clerk, "Just one room. 1 bed is fine." He'd used the excuse of saving money, but we both knew that wasn't it. That night, lying next to him in a bed that wasn't mine, in a town whose name I didn't know, felt different. The pretense of my home, of my bed as a sanctuary he was borrowing, was gone. We were on neutral ground, and we had chosen this proximity, which brought us to Nebraska. To this specific room, with its water-stained ceiling and the hum of the ice machine. It was our 5th night on the road. We had spent the day exploring a strange, beautiful landscape of sandhills and wide-open sky. I had taken hundreds of photos, losing myself behind the lens, while Julian had simply stood there, letting the wind whip through his hair, a small, genuine smile on his face. The mood had been light, hopeful, but as night fell, the familiar tension had crept back in, thicker than ever. And now he was here, in my bed, having crossed the room in a silent, deliberate act of surrender. He lay beside me, a rigid line of heat and unspoken need, and the world narrowed to the few inches of mattress between us. My heart was a frantic bird beating against the cage of my ribs. Every instinct screamed at me to keep feigning sleep, to wait for him to give up and retreat to the safety of his own bed. It was the safe choice. It was the choice that preserved the friendship, that kept the fragile ecosystem of our relationship from collapsing. But as I lay there, I realized I was tired. I was tired of the silence, tired of the pretense, tired of the crushing weight of my own unspoken love. For years, I had been the observer, the one who documented life from a safe distance. But you can't photograph your own life when you're not living it. You can't capture a feeling you're too afraid to feel. With a slowness that felt monumental, I turned onto my side, facing him. My eyes were open. In the dim, murky light, I could see that his were open too. They were wide and dark and filled with a terrifying vulnerability. We just looked at each other. No words. The air vibrated. It was a moment of pure, terrifying honesty. The masks were gone. The excuses had evaporated. There was only us, 2 people suspended in a moment of unbearable truth. His lips parted, as if to speak, but no sound came out. He just swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. Then he moved. It was a fractional movement, a closing of the final inch that separated us. His forehead came to rest against mine. I could feel the slight tremor in his body, or maybe it was my own. His breath, warm and smelling faintly of the coffee we'd had hours earlier, ghosted across my lips. "Leo," he whispered. His voice was a raw, frayed thing. It was not a question. It was a plea. And in that moment, I made a choice. I closed the final millimeter of space between us. The first touch of our lips was impossibly soft. It wasn't a kiss of passion, or of lust, or of triumphant arrival. It was a kiss of confession. It was hesitant and questioning and unbearably tender. It was the sound of a door, locked and barred for years, finally creaking open. It was the feeling of a breath held for a lifetime, finally being released. In the humming silence of that cheap motel room, with the highway groaning outside, everything I had known fell apart, and something new, something fragile and terrifying and beautiful, began to take its place. The morning after felt like waking up in a different world. The sun streamed through the thin curtains, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air, but the light felt harsh, accusatory. The tender, liminal space of the night had vanished, and in its place was the stark, awkward reality of day. I woke up first. Julian was still asleep, but sometime in the night, the tentative space between us had collapsed. He was curled against my back, one heavy arm draped over my waist, his face buried in my shoulder. His breathing was deep and even. For a few blissful, hazy moments, I allowed myself to just exist in that reality. This was it. This was the thing I had yearned for in 1,000 silent, lonely moments. His warmth was a solid, grounding presence. It felt like coming home. But then, awareness began to seep in, cold and unwelcome. What now? What did that kiss, that silent, desperate collision in the dark, actually mean? Was it a beginning, or was it a beautiful, tragic mistake? I lay perfectly still, not wanting to wake him, not wanting the spell to break. But my stillness was a cage of anxiety. I was terrified of the moment he would wake up, and we would have to face what we had done. The silence was no longer full of unspoken longing. It was full of unspoken questions. Eventually, he stirred. The arm around my waist tightened for a moment, a sleepy, unconscious gesture that sent a jolt straight to my heart. Then he tensed. I felt it instantly, a sudden rigidity that spread through his whole body. He was awake. He knew where he was, and who he was with. Slowly, carefully, he withdrew his arm. He shifted away from me, creating a chasm of cold air on the mattress. I didn't move. I kept my eyes closed, my breathing even, once again feigning sleep. It was a cowardly act, but I couldn't bear to see the look on his face. I couldn't bear to see regret. I heard him slide out of bed. I heard the soft padding of his feet on the carpet, the rustle of clothes as he dressed, the click of his suitcase latches. He was getting ready with a brisk, unnatural efficiency. He was building a wall of activity between us. Finally, I heard the jingle of the car keys. That was the sound that forced my eyes open. He was standing by the door, his back to me, his hand on the knob. He was going to leave. He was going to walk out of this room without a word and pretend that last night never happened. "Julian," I said. My voice was rough with sleep. He froze, his shoulders hunching. He didn't turn around. "Morning," he said, his voice tight and unnaturally cheerful. Figured I'd go grab us some coffee. The lie was so blatant, so insulting, that it pierced through my fear. "Don't," I said, sitting up. The sheet pulled around my waist. "Don't do that." He finally turned to face me. The expression on his face was a complicated mess of panic and guilt. He wouldn't meet my eyes. He looked at the wall, at the television, at the floor, anywhere but at me. "Don't do what?" he asked, his attempt at nonchalance failing miserably. "It's just coffee, don't pretend," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "Don't pretend last night was nothing." A pained expression flickered across his face. "Leo, He started, then stopped. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of pure frustration. I'm tired. It's been a long drive. We should just hit the road." He was shutting down, retreating behind a wall of platitudes and logistics. The open, vulnerable man from the night before was gone, replaced by this panicked stranger. The hope that had bloomed in my chest began to wither. I had misread everything. The kiss wasn't a confession. It was a symptom of his loneliness, a moment of weakness. I was just a convenient, warm body. The thought was a shard of ice in my gut. The next 2 days were a special kind of hell. We got back in the car, and the small, enclosed space that had felt like an intimate cocoon now felt like a prison cell. Julian drove, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, his jaw tight. He put on a podcast, filling the car with the noise of other people's voices, a buffer to prevent any real conversation between us. The silence beneath the noise was deafening. I retreated behind my own shield, the camera. At scenic overlooks, I would get out and lose myself in the mechanics of aperture and shutter speed, focusing on capturing the light on a distant mountain range because I couldn't bear to look at the darkness in the car beside me. I felt a cold, bitter anger begin to build inside me. It wasn't just disappointment. It was a sense of betrayal. He had initiated everything. He had crossed the room. He had leaned in. He had whispered my name. He had opened that door, just a crack, and shown me a glimpse of a world I had only ever dreamed of, only to slam it shut in my face the moment the sun came up. I felt like a fool, a naive, hopeful idiot who had mistaken a cry for help for a declaration of love. The breaking point came on the third day, somewhere in the stark, beautiful emptiness of the Utah desert. We had been driving for hours in near total silence, the podcast having ended an hour ago, leaving a vacuum that neither of us dared to fill. Julian was staring straight ahead, his face a grim mask. I couldn't take it anymore. The unspoken tension was a physical thing, a toxic gas filling the car, and I was suffocating. "Pull over," I said. My voice cut through the silence like a knife. Julian flinched, startled. "What? Why?" "There's nothing here, just pull over," I said, my voice rising. Now he shot me a look, a mixture of annoyance and fear, but he did it. He wrenched the wheel, and the car bumped to a stop on the gravel shoulder of the empty two-lane highway. The engine died, and the sudden, absolute silence of the desert rushed in. It was a silence so profound it seemed to have weight. I turned in my seat to face him. "Talk to me," I said. It wasn't a request. It was a demand. "Say something. Anything. Yell at me. Tell me I'm crazy. Tell me it was a mistake. I don't care. But you have to stop this. You have to stop pretending I don't exist." He wouldn't look at me. He just stared out the windshield at the endless expanse of red rock and blue sky. "There's nothing to talk about," he mumbled. "Nothing to talk about." I could hear the tremor in my own voice, a dangerous cocktail of hurt and rage. "You kissed me, Julian. You came into my bed and you kissed me. And then you spent 2 days treating me like I'm a piece of furniture. You don't get to do that. You don't get to light a fire and then just walk away and act surprised when the house starts to burn down." That finally got a reaction. He squeezed his eyes shut, and his whole body seemed to deflate. He rested his forehead against the steering wheel, a gesture of complete and utter defeat. "I know," he whispered. His voice was choked. "I know. I'm sorry. Sorry isn't good enough." I pushed, my anger softening slightly at the sight of his distress. "I need to understand. What is going on in your head?" He was silent for a long time. I could see his shoulders shaking. When he finally lifted his head and turned to look at me, his eyes were red-rimmed and swimming with tears. The sight broke my heart. "I don't know," he said, his voice cracking. "That's the problem, Leo. I don't know." He took a shaky breath. "Ever since Amanda left, I've been so lost. It's like the map of my life just went up in flames. And you've been the only thing that felt solid. The only thing that made sense. Being at your place, it was the only time I could breathe." He looked down at his hands, twisting them in his lap. "That night, in the motel, I wasn't thinking. I needed to be close to you. It was like a magnet. And then I kissed you. And for 1 second, it felt right. It felt more right than anything has in a year." He looked up at me, his eyes pleading for understanding. "But then I woke up, and I was so scared. What if I'm just using you? What if you're just a bandage for what she did to me? I couldn't do that to you. Our friendship is the most important thing in my life. I was so terrified that I had just destroyed it for a moment of selfish comfort. His confession hung in the silent car, honest and raw and painful. He wasn't rejecting me. He was trying to protect me. He was trying to protect us. The anger drained out of me, replaced by a wave of profound, aching tenderness. He was just as lost and scared as I was. We were both just standing in the rubble of what we thought our lives were supposed to be, terrified of taking a single step. The vast, empty desert outside seemed to hold its breath, waiting for my response. The fire I had accused him of starting was still burning, but I realized now it wasn't a fire of destruction. It was a signal fire, a beacon in the dark, and we were both standing right in the middle of it. I looked at him, at his tear-streaked face and his desperate, frightened eyes, and a profound calm settled over me. The fear that had been my constant companion for years, the fear of ruining our friendship, the fear of being rejected, the fear of my own feelings, it all just fell away. It was stripped bare by the brutal honesty of this moment. In this car, in the middle of nowhere. All that was left was the truth. I reached across the center console and took his hand. His fingers were cold, but they curled around mine instantly, desperately. "You think you're the only one who's scared?" I asked, my voice soft. He looked at me, confused. "Julian," I said, and I had to take a breath before I could continue. "I have been in love with you for 9 years." The words came out, and the world didn't end. The car didn't explode. The sky didn't fall. The only thing that happened was that the expression on Julian's face shifted from one of panicked confusion to one of stunned, dawning wonder. He just stared at me, his mouth slightly agape. The tears that had been welling in his eyes finally spilled over, but they weren't tears of sadness anymore. 9 years, he whispered, his voice full of disbelief. I nodded, a small, sad smile touching my lips. Since that stupid project in college, I just buried it. I told myself the friendship was enough. And it was. It really was. But it was also not. I squeezed his hand. So when you talk about being scared of ruining our friendship, that's been my reality every single day for almost a decade. What you did the other night, that wasn't selfish. It wasn't you using me. It was you finally seeing me. The real me. The one who's been waiting for you this whole time. My own confession, laid bare in the stark desert light, changed everything. It recontextualized the entire history of our relationship. It took the narrative of his confusion and my convenience and replaced it with a story of mutual, unspoken longing. I had given him the one piece of information he needed to make sense of his own feelings. He wasn't going crazy. He wasn't using his grieving best friend. He was responding to a signal I had been sending out, faintly and unconsciously, for years. He pulled his hand from mine, but only to reach out and cup my face, his thumb gently wiping away a tear I hadn't even realized had fallen. His touch was no longer hesitant or uncertain. It was deliberate. It was sure. "Leo," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I am so sorry. I'm such an idiot." A wet, shaky laugh escaped him. 9 years. And I had no idea. I just thought you were the best person I'd ever met. "You're not an idiot," I said. "You were just living your life." And I was hiding, no more hiding, he said, his voice a low, firm promise. Not for either of us. And then he leaned across the console and kissed me again. This kiss was nothing like the first one. There was no hesitation, no fear. It was a kiss of recognition. It was a kiss that said, "Oh, there you are. I've been looking for you." It was full of the sorrow of lost time and the brilliant, explosive hope of a new beginning. It was the closing of a chapter and the turning of a page, all in one motion. We stayed like that for a long time, parked on the side of an empty highway, the world outside disappearing until the only things that existed were the two of us, finally speaking the same language. We didn't drive any further that day. We found another cheap motel in the next small town, but this time, the choice of a single bed was not an unspoken negotiation. It was a statement. We checked in, and the moment the door closed behind us, we were in each other's arms. There was a frantic, desperate energy at first, a need to reaffirm the reality of what had just happened, to erase the pain of the last few days with the physical certainty of touch. But that soon gave way to something else, something quieter and more profound. We lay on the bed, fully clothed, just holding each other. We talked for hours. We unspooled the last 9 years of our lives, re-examining moments through this new lens. I told him about the ache of watching him with his girlfriends, and he told me about the strange, persistent feeling he always had that something was missing, a sense of being not quite home, even when he was supposedly happy. He talked about how my quiet presence had always felt like a magnetic north, a point of stability he constantly reoriented himself toward without ever understanding why. We were like two archaeologists, dusting off the artifacts of our shared history and discovering that the story they told was completely different from the one we had believed. That night, we slept, but it was a different kind of sleep. There was no pretense, no careful distance. We slept tangled together, my head on his chest, his arms securely around me. I fell asleep to the steady, reassuring rhythm of his heartbeat, a sound I had been listening to from a distance for years, now finally right there, against my ear. It was the most peaceful sleep I had ever had. The rest of the road trip was a dream. The world outside the car seemed to have turned from black and white to color. The desert landscapes were no longer just beautiful compositions for my camera. They were the backdrop to our new beginning. We held hands across the center console. We stopped at roadside attractions and took stupid pictures of each other. I took photos of him, really looked at him through my lens for the first time without the filter of my secret, and I saw a joy in his face that was so pure and bright it made my heart ache. He was not just my subject anymore. He was my view. When we finally reached the Pacific Ocean, it felt like a pilgrimage completed. We stood on a cliff overlooking the vast, endless blue, the wind whipping our hair, and Julian turned to me. "So this is the horizon," he said, a slow smile spreading across his face. "It's better than I imagined." He wasn't looking at the ocean. He was looking at me. The return journey was quieter, more domestic. The frantic energy of discovery had been replaced by the calm certainty of arrival. We were no longer hurtling toward an unknown destination. We were driving home. The question of what home meant hung in the air, but this time, it wasn't a source of anxiety. It was a quiet, hopeful promise. When we pulled up to my apartment building, it felt both familiar and completely new. We carried our bags up the stairs in a comfortable silence. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, and Julian followed me. He dropped his duffel bag on the floor of the living room, not by the door as a guest would, but in the center of the room, as if it belonged there. He looked around the space, at my photos on the walls, at the worn armchair, at the couch where this new chapter had so tentatively begun. "It's good to be home," he said softly. That night, as we got ready for bed, I noticed he didn't even glance toward the spare room. He walked straight into my bedroom, my room that was now becoming our room. I followed him in, my heart full. He got into bed, on the side that had unofficially become his, and watched me as I moved around the room. I went to the door, my hand hovering over the knob. For months, that door had been a symbol of our ambiguity, left ajar as a silent, uncertain invitation. I looked back at him. He was watching me with a soft, loving expression. He gave me a small nod. I closed the door. The soft click of the latch echoed in the quiet room. It was a sound of finality, of certainty. It was the sound of a question being answered. The sound of a fortress lowering its drawbridge for good. I got into bed beside him, and he immediately rolled over, pulling me against him. He kissed my forehead, a long, lingering kiss that spoke of safety and permanence. In the beautiful, honest silence we had learned to create together, we didn't need to say a word. We had crossed the country, navigated the treacherous landscapes of our own fears and histories, and found our way back here. We had found our way to each other. The journey had been long and terrifying, but as I lay there, wrapped in his arms, I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that we were finally, truly home. The greatest discoveries, I realized, are not made by mapping the world, but by bravely navigating the small, sacred space between two people. And our map, finally, was leading us to the same place. We began to heal, not in the noise of grand declarations, but in the quiet, gentle rhythm of making coffee together in the morning sun.